Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with the last lecture for Anatomy and Physiology 2. It's on the female reproductive system, and it covers the hormones that regulate both the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. Collectively, we call this the female reproductive cycle because the cycle of the two organs are so closely linked. The image that you're looking at is of a uterus and an implanted embryo at 16 to 18 days of development. Implantation occurs after fertilization between the second and third week of human development. And I wanted to show this picture because what we're going to be talking about is preparing the endometrium for implantation, as well as earlier producing a gamete, a functional gamete that can be fertilized. So the picture shows the endometrial lining. It's quite thick. So the stratum functionalis is quite thick. And the embryo and developing placenta are right here. The thin line, I guess it's dark, the thin line of cells here, that is the developing embryo. At least what we can see is ectoderm, which will eventually give rise to the skin and the nervous system. Eventually, the neural tube will form, and that will be the basis for neural development. And the yolk sac is attached to the ventral surface of the embryo, and it can be seen as a circle here underneath the embryo. The placenta is shown as kind of a blur of cells attaching the embryo to the endometrium. Okay, recall that the hormones that regulate the ovary and the uterus are gonadotropin releasing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, estrogen, and progesterone. So we have 5 hormones, and gonadotropin releasing hormone is made in the hypothalamus, and it travels to the anterior pituitary in the portal system between the two. And it stimulates the anterior pituitary to release these 2 gonadotropins. One is follicle stimulating hormone, known as FSH for short. It does what it sounds like it does. It stimulates the development of a follicle around a developing gamete. So we'll look at the follicle again. The other gonadotropin is luteinizing hormone, known as LH for short, and it is responsible for stimulating development of the gamete or the oocyte. So the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are acting on the ovary, and this is what they do in the ovary: stimulate development of the follicle and development of the oocyte. In response, the ovary is going to have some cells differentiate that make more hormones, and those cells produce estrogen and progesterone. Both of these hormones are going to travel in the bloodstream to the uterus and cause changes in the uterine endometrium. Estrogen stimulates the endometrium to proliferate, and progesterone stimulates spiral arteries that supply the endometrium to vasodilate. Both of these things prepare the uterus for a possible pregnancy. So let's start with the female reproductive hormones and their actions during childhood, before puberty onset. Before puberty, the ovaries are growing and they release a small amount of estrogen during childhood, throughout childhood. And this estrogen promotes the development of the reproductive system, the reproductive organs, as well as feminine physique and secondary sex characteristics, things like fat deposition. Even this low estrogen level inhibits the hypothalamus, and this occurs through a negative feedback mechanism, and so gonadotropin-releasing hormone is not released before puberty. But at puberty, due to the development of the brain and also changes in the fat content of various tissues throughout the female body, the hypothalamus becomes less sensitive to this estrogen negative feedback. So it's no longer inhibited at the onset of puberty by this estrogen. And if there are enough fat stores and leptin secretion by the fat or by the adipose tissue, then the hypothalamus will begin releasing gonadotropin-releasing hormone. Now, it might take up to 4 years before gonadotropin-releasing hormone is sufficient to stimulate the rest of what we're going to talk about. And that would be the gonadotropin-releasing hormone actions on the anterior pituitary hormone actions on the ovary, and the ovarian hormone actions on the uterus. But we'll just assume that we've reached that mark where gonadotropin-releasing hormone is adequate. And when it is, it stimulates the anterior pituitary to release follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Both of these stimulate the ovary. Specifically, FSH causes the granulosa cells in follicles to make estrogen. And the luteinizing hormone causes the thecal cells that are in the follicle to release androgens. One example of an androgen is testosterone. Most androgens are going to be converted into estradiol, which is the major estrogen, by those granulosa cells. So ultimately, FSH and LH stimulate production of estrogen in the ovary. These estrogens stimulate breast development, endometrial proliferation, as well as oogenesis. And we'll talk about that more as we proceed. So this adult female sexual cycle, or reproductive cycle, is perfectly orchestrated. We will see that the development of the uterus, or the uterine environment, is perfectly in sync with the timing of the production of a gamete. So that 6 days after ovulation, the oocyte will reach, a fertilized oocyte, will reach a thickened uterine lining. Now, if the oocyte is not fertilized, another series of events occur, and we'll talk about that too. This cycle of preparing the uterus, releasing an oocyte, averages about 28 days in length. Of course, there's variations, 20 to 45 days, but we can think of it as repeating each month. And that's how we'll treat it. So each month in the adult female, gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus rises and stimulates the anterior pituitary to release those two gonadotropins, FSH and LH. Specifically, what FSH and LH do is act on the ovary, where FSH stimulates the follicle to develop. More follicle cells will be formed. Eventually, we will have an antral follicle. And so FSH also really participates in ovulation. And we'll look at how, because LH also does. But the follicle granulosa cells then respond to the FSH and begin producing estrogen. LH stimulates oocyte maturation. FSH doesn't really do that. And so oocyte maturation versus development of the follicle involves a primary oocyte, not follicular cells. And the primary oocyte, in response to LH, will complete meiosis I and begin meiosis II. LH also stimulates ovulation by weakening the wall of the ovary, making it easier for rupture of the follicle and release of the oocyte. Ultimately, LH will then transform a ruptured follicle into a structure called the corpus luteum. And it's the corpus luteum in the ovary that makes progesterone. Now, what do estrogen and progesterone do to the uterus? How do they act on the uterus to prepare it for this hopefully fertilized oocyte that's just been released? Estrogen will cause the endometrium to enter what's known as the proliferative phase. So the stratum functionalis, stratum basalis, and the stratum functionalis will be undergoing mitosis. And progesterone causes the stratum functionalis in particular to enter the secretory phase. And the secretory phase, you might remember, involves secreting glycogen-rich fluid, which will help provide nutrients to a developing embryo. At some point, progesterone will decline, especially when there is no fertilization and therefore no implantation of an embryo. And when it declines, that causes the menstrual phase of the endometrium. And so the stratum functionalis will be shed. Now that's quite a bit of information. So we're going to go through these various steps one by one together and talk about what happens. And we're going to use a lot of diagrams in doing so. So let's start with our first kind of picture or diagram. We have the hypothalamus releasing, the hypothalamus is up above, releasing GnRH, which causes the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH. FSH is going to involve development of the follicle, which are collectively the cells surrounding the oocyte, and the oocyte is in the center. In response, those follicular cells will make estrogen, and estrogen will act on the endometrium, which is shown here. LH, in contrast, will help with ovulation of the oocyte, or rupture of the follicle, and then transform the follicle into this structure called the corpus luteum, which you may remember looks yellow because of the lipid that it makes. In addition, the corpus luteum secretes progesterone, and progesterone will be acting on the endometrium as well, causing the secretory phase. And so this is a picture of the secretory phase, where the uterine glands become coiled and they start secreting glycogen-rich fluid. So there's a lot of different things that happen. We can look at levels of FSH and LH over the monthly period, so from day 1 to day 28. And so we can look at how those hormone levels change, and you can see they're pretty flat, and then there are these big spikes, and then there's a decrease, and then it rises again, and we're going to explain how that happens. In response to those hormones, we see changes in the follicle and the oocyte in the ovaries. And that's what this part of the diagram talks about, is what is happening in the ovary in response to LH and FSH at the same time where we see spikes and then declines. You might remember that there's two phases of the ovarian cycle: the follicular phase when the follicles develop, and then the luteal phase where the corpus luteum predominates. Also, the uterus, I'm sorry, not the uterus, the ovary is producing hormones of its own, estrogen and progesterone. And it's the granulosa cells in the follicle that make the estrogen. And you can see how estrogen production rises and then declines and then rises again, and we're going to explain why that happens. And the thecal cells, as well as, well, not the thecal cells, but the corpus luteum is what makes progesterone. And you can see that it kind of makes sense that the progesterone level is going to be highest in the luteal phase when the corpus luteum is present. Those hormone levels, ovarian hormone levels, estrogen and progesterone, and the changes in their levels influence the status of the uterus, the endometrium in particular. So when estrogens rise, we see a thickening in the lining of the uterus, the endometrium, and even more so when progesterone increases. But then when we have a sharp drop, particularly in progesterone, we see that's the end of the thickening stage of the endometrium, and we enter the menstrual phase. And so the menstrual phase continues over here. So we're going to go through each of those things and how FSH influences the ovary and how LH influences the ovary. Then we're going to talk about how what's happening in the ovary causes these different levels of hormones. Then we'll look at how those hormones affect the uterus. And we're going to kind of go in a stepwise fashion. I think this is a great diagram to use to kind of correlate everything that's happening, but it is a lot, so I'm going to break it down as we go through the different topics in pieces and parts. So there's a worksheet on Blackboard that contains this diagram, as well as questions that you can answer as we go through the lecture. So you might want to stop here, go to Blackboard, and print out the worksheet unless you've received it from me previously. Then you might already have one. So the first thing we're going to do is connect the pituitary hormone levels with the ovarian cycle. So we're just going to assume that gonadotropin releasing hormone is adequate. It's been released by the hypothalamus, and now the pituitary is releasing LH and FSH as it should. Okay, so the top picture shows the levels of the anterior pituitary hormones. It's hard to write fast with this thing. And then the middle picture shows what's happening in the ovary, specifically the follicular phase, ovulation, and the luteal phase. And the bottom picture shows hormone production by the ovary, estrogen and progesterone. So the first thing that happens is that in response to gonadotropin releasing hormone, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone levels begin to rise. And that's kind of right here. They begin to rise. There is a plateau period, but they were lower previous. So they're rising at point 1 here. This correlates with the follicular phase of the ovary. And both LH and FSH stimulate the follicles to grow. So you might remember there's a cohort of follicles that will begin changing, progressing through different stages. So here what we have is follicular growth. FSH also causes the granulosa cells that are in the follicle to release estrogen. So that's why we see estrogen beginning to rise shortly after we see the follicular growth phase. Now, estrogen exerts negative feedback to the hypothalamus and to the anterior pituitary. So what will happen in response to that is, if you see that we've got estrogen pretty high right here, not as high as it could be, but it's going to cause a dip in both FSH and LH. It's really FSH that makes the biggest difference. This dip is important in FSH because it is what determines which of the follicles that have been developing in the ovary will become the dominant follicle. Only the dominant follicle can survive this decrease in FSH. And the decrease, remember, is all due to negative feedback by the estrogen on the pituitary gland. So there'll be less FSH production. Now, the reason that this follicle, number 5, has become dominant is because it happens to be the follicle that has the best receptors for follicle stimulating hormone, meaning those receptors, and therefore the cells that have those receptors, are most sensitive to estrogen. They can detect even low levels of estrogen, and so that follicle will continue to develop and grow. The rest of them will undergo atresia and eventually die. So early on, as the young follicles are growing, and we haven't quite yet made a dominant follicle. That's coming up next. The granulosa cells that are making estrogen are actually inhibiting both the hypothalamus, or at least the estrogen is, and the pituitary. And that causes a decrease in FSH. Ultimately, that's going to make this young follicle become a dominant follicle. So that's what happens first. Now what happens is something referred to as the positive feedback system, where we produce high levels of FSH and LH. But let's start where we were. We were at the dominant follicle. It was super sensitive to this low FSH level. It continues to thrive and grow. And as it grows, it becomes really big, an antral follicle. And it secretes an enormous amount of estrogen, which we see here, this spike in estrogen. I mean, this is just one follicle producing that much estrogen. Whereas before we had quite a few young follicles making, lower levels of estrogen. So this super high level of estrogen provides positive feedback to the hypothalamus and the pituitary. Positive feedback. What that means is, instead of negative feedback and decreasing FSH, the positive feedback causes a spike in FSH as well as what we refer to as a surge in LH release or production. We just call it the LH surge. So we get a surge in LH and an increase in FSH. It's really the LH that makes the biggest difference. So this example of positive feedback of estrogen on the anterior pituitary only happens once you've already got a dominant follicle, because this dominant follicle is producing enormous levels of estrogen. And it's this very, very high level of estrogen that causes positive feedback. When it's just a mediocre level of estrogen, we get negative feedback. So the end result of producing a dominant follicle is lots of estrogen production and positive feedback on the pituitary to make it increase lots of luteinizing hormone. Now, what are the effects of this huge LH surge shown in blue and number 7 at the top up here? What are the effects of that, particularly on the ovary? Because that's what that hormone acts on. That's the organ. It acts on the ovary. Well, the first thing that it does is cause the oocyte in the dominant follicle to finish meiosis 1 and begin meiosis 2. So we could call this oocyte maturation. Not follicle development, but the individual oocyte. In addition, it kind of weakens the wall of the ovary, and this antral follicle is close to the wall of the ovary, but it promotes, nonetheless, it promotes ovulation. So rupture of the follicle and release of the oocyte from the ovary. So those are the first two things that this LH surge does. And so often ovulation kits are looking for high levels of LH, trying to detect when ovulation is going to happen by looking at peaks and valleys in LH production. Okay, so after we have ovulation, now we've got a follicle that doesn't have an oocyte anymore, and luteinizing hormone transforms this ruptured follicle into a structure that we call the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is going to eventually make progesterone. But first, what's important to think about is that these follicle cells don't exist anymore. And so they're not making estrogen. And so you see this dip in estrogen production because the dominant follicle exists no more. It's not making that high level of estrogen, and estrogen levels decrease in the blood. Now, progesterone is going to increase during this time period, shown as number 12. And that's because the corpus luteum begins making that hormone. So progesterone is released by the corpus luteum. Now, the corpus luteum does make some estrogens, not as high of a level as the dominant follicle. It also makes a hormone called inhibin. And inhibin will act on the anterior pituitary to keep FSH levels low. And the idea is, if you keep FSH levels low, no more follicles are going to, mature or develop, in the hopes that this oocyte that was released gets fertilized. We're not ready to release another oocyte at this stage. So it's important to know what the functions of the LH surge are. It signals, the LH surge causes the oocyte to complete meiosis 1 and start meiosis 2. It causes rupture of the follicle and ovulation of a secondary oocyte, as well as the polar body that's attached to it. and it helps form the corpus luteum. That's what the LH surge does.